All right, so guys, this is part one of our series on how to use KTC as leverage in your dynasty market. We're starting with quarterback. Scott, we always start off with a trade. Are you going Drake Maye or Dak Prescott and Jordan Addison? Go ahead, man.
Start 10. Obviously, I'm getting a quarterback back with Dak, keeping his offensive coordinator. That's one thing that's getting lost in the Brian Schottenheimer hire is it is the same offensive coordinator that he's had the last couple of years. I think we could probably expect similar stuff from the offense going forward. So what can I do with Jordan Addison? Can I move Jordan Addison for a tier up? Can I move Jordan Addison for a first? Can I address another need with him? I think if you put a first on the other side, a lot of people would say, oh, I'm fine with Dak in a first. Even if you like Drake Maye, and you think Drake Maye can be a top 8 quarterback, Dak's been a top 10 quarterback numerous times. So if you're willing to just buy in that he could give you top 12, top 15 on his worst day, as long as he stays healthy, I think the leverage side is clearly the Addison side. But in a start 10, if your market isn't robust enough, you may be stuck with Jordan Addison, and then you have a problem where you have too many Jordan Addison types, sure. And you're like, what do I do with one of these? But I'm guessing I can turn the Addison or another player similar to him to a first, and if that's the case, then I would do Dak in the first.
Shane, which side are you going, man? 12-team Superflex, PPR, 1.75 to the tight end, start 10. That does not include kicker and defense. Drake Maye or Prescott and Addison?
So you get the QB8 or you get a QB that's outside the top 20. I think even if you think you can get a first for Jordan Addison, you can't. It's unlikely, at least. I understand it being a process deal. You do get a starting wide receiver that you can plug into your lineup. Dak should be fine enough. I think just the ceiling is a lot higher on Maye, though. And the fact that he's up to QB8 already when he didn't do much of anything. Like, I know he had a fun few games, but he didn't smash, and he did it with no weapons. So if we're just looking at ceiling, I think Drake Maye's could be higher and his value could hold a lot better than, let's say, Addison plus Dak. So I think I'm actually going to take Drake Maye here. But I've said it before, I am a Drake Maye slut, so that probably has a little bit to do with it.
Drake Maye is definitely likable. Scott, is part of this the fact that this is likely your QB2 that we're talking about?
It could be. But I think the thing with Drake Maye is he's actually benefiting from the fact that he wasn't great as a rookie. He was great relative to the expectations that people have. And because he hasn't started off with massive expectations, people are actually overcorrecting for how great he actually was. So you're going to sit here and tell me I'm just betting that Drake Maye is going to have a 20-plus point per game season sometime in the next couple of years? That still might not even get him inside the top 5. So I think it's because the expectations were that Drake Maye was in a terrible situation with no weapons, and then he was good, not great, but he did it with the reasons that Shane said, is we just immediately assume, well, he's going to have amazing weapons going forward, and the coaching staff is going to be awesome. The point is, I think he's getting credit because there were low expectations, whereas Caleb Williams is getting shit on because there were high expectations. I would guess both of them are not going to end up in the top 5 or better. That's pretty lofty when neither of them are even probably one of the top 2 fantasy quarterbacks from their own class. So I think this is just a percentage bet. Could Drake Maye be the next Josh Allen? Yes. But there's a much higher likelihood that he just settles in that QB 6 to 15 range. And unless your plan is, and here's where I think Shane could be right, I'll give myself, a little bit of a devil's advocate argument. If it appears that Drake Maye, like say the first 3 games, he runs for 80 yards a game and looks like he's throwing at peak Josh Allen, will you then trade him for the leverage deal like this, but even more? And if the answer is no, then you are already dug in that he's basically the next Josh Allen, or this is probably a deal I'm going to regret. Can you get a first for Jordan Addison? Maybe not. But if I have T. Higgins or DJ Moore or Devontae Smith or one of those guys, I can get a first for them probably. So it's more like the process of just replacing T. Higgins on my roster with Jordan Addison, which I'm comfortable doing, and getting a first for the guy I can get a first for. That's where the leverage comes in. It's not about Addison. I agree. If you spam Addison for a 26 first, a lot of teams are going to go, I understand the giving up my flexibility for, a capped wide receiver 2 is probably not a smart process, but there's probably another player that you're either flexing or starting that you can make that move with. And it's just hard for me to turn down a deal like this when I'm getting, maybe I'm a little down on Dak Prescott, but I think this shows, what'd you say, Dak was QB 20 on KTC, QB 21? That gap between QB 8 and 20 is this is a sweet spot. If you're willing to bet against players in this range or for players in this range, I think you can get some extra assets playing in these waters.
Yeah, I'm going to say I have a problem with Michael Penix Jr. What are we doing here? Like, he had 3 nice games, but that's it. So those 4 nice games, we've decided that he's a better value asset than Brock Purdy, which is just asinine. Brock Purdy's had close to elite seasons under his belt. He did fairly well considering that every one of his offensive weapons was injured last year, one being shot, one having pneumonia at one point. Like, it was just an absolute car wreck there. I'm not sure why Michael Penix is so high. I could understand him being over Bryce Young, JJ McCarthy. This is going to feel weird. I don't even like Trevor Lawrence, and I don't think Trevor Lawrence should be below Michael Penix. What does Michael Penix give you that Trevor Lawrence doesn't? He doesn't run. So just going back to Brock Purdy. Purdy gives you rushing points, right? He is a scrambler. It's in his wheelhouse is what I'm saying. Like, it's a threat. It could happen every week, whereas Michael Penix is not. Like, he's not going to give you those points. It feels wrong to me that he is literally right behind Baker Mayfield, who also at 14 feels kind of low to me. I like Kyler. I like Jordan Love. Bo Nix had an excellent rookie season, but Baker just went out there and put up a monster season. But it looks like he's everything we ever thought he was. Why Russell Wilson is in the top 30 at all, I don't know. Derek Carr, no idea. I understand the fact that they get to start football games, but that doesn't really make them valuable. And I do think it's interesting, Justin Fields at 25. It feels like the community wants to pump him up. And if he gets a starting gig somewhere, he's going to fly up the board, probably over Tua. I wouldn't be surprised to see him jump Dak Prescott and Jared Goff.
Scott, any others stick out to you?
Yeah, I think if you look at this big cluster of quarterbacks, they're almost tiered in terms of how people just feel about them right now. Like, if I told you that Trevor Lawrence, historical #1 overall pick, has a top 12 season tied to the one offensive coordinator in the league besides Ben Johnson that almost every team would have hired, and he has the best rookie receiver from last year tied to him, along with a top 5, 6 tight end, and people say Trevor Lawrence doesn't have a ceiling, right? But Bryce Young has a ceiling, even though he's never come close to Trevor Lawrence in terms of production. And we don't count the Bryce Young week 18 game last year, which was his best game ever. If you exclude that, he has 4 games over 20 points in his career. And so I think T-Law is he's being punished because people expected more quicker. Then after his year 2, they expected way more because they forgave him for year 1. And then he's kind of just flatlined into, he's probably QB 12, QB 13, QB 14. But I look at this range as can I really pivot from Michael Penix to Trevor Lawrence and get anything? That's where I think this range can be exploited, but it's not guaranteed just based on these KTC prices. You can't just say, well, I have Brock Purdy. I can go trade for Tua Tagovailoa plus. KTC says you can, but I think this range is very much just who do I prefer? Who does the manager that has these two prefer? And how do you want to build your roster? You could also argue that if you go all the way down to Anthony Richardson and Sam Darnold, I think that's the end of the tier. Those two, I think, are guaranteed to start all of 2025, and they've shown some ceiling in the past, whether you believe it's going to be sustainable or continued. That's 24 quarterbacks that 2/3 of those, if I told you that's my QB2, I would say I feel good about that. But I could also argue where I can replace a lot of these guys for probably something even cheaper if I'm willing to do it. So I just think this is not a place in the market where you can make a lot of pivots. And so if you can sell somebody that Baker Mayfield without now Dave Canales and Liam Cohen is just way better than Trevor Lawrence, there's probably an angle there. But can you actually get that deal done? That's what I'm a little curious. Probably got to try it. It probably stops at Bo Nix, Jordan Love, Kyler. That's probably the cutoff. But from Baker all the way down to probably Richardson and Darnold, there's 10 or 11 guys where coin flip how somebody else would have them ordered.
Yeah, and just looking at that rankings, do you care if you have Bryce Young versus Jared Goff? Do you care which one is on your roster? None of these players inspire any conviction, right? Maybe you want to shoot for an Anthony Richardson because you're look, if the stars align and everything goes right, what this guy could be is elite. But it feels everyone from QB 17 through 32, excluding the guys that won't be starting, Will Levis, Daniel Jones, I don't care which one I have. There's absolutely no conviction. If you were to offer me any of those dudes and for another dude I have on my roster and expect me to give you anything, I'm just not going to. So to Scott's point, that means I should probably be looking to move Bryce Young for everyone in that range plus the third. I don't know if you'll get it, but like that's what I should be trying to do because you don't care. And I don't know what the differentiating factors are between most of them. Maybe JJ McCarthy, right? Because if he gets in there and is decent, he has room to move up this list.
So Scott, going back to T-Law real quick, would you tear down from a Caleb Williams to T-Law in that case? Would you make a move like that?
I think it's very similar to the Dak, Drake May, Caleb, T-Law. Like you're taking a gamble on a guy that I think it's punished a little bit because we used to value Trevor Lawrence as a top 8 quarterback, and that was probably just wrong. But I think it's also funny that when you bring up the fact that Caleb or Drake May could kind of end up being T-Law, people are like, oh, there's no way. But then you said that about CJ Stroud, and you're like, oh, there's no way. And then it looks like he might be closer to T-Law than end up being Josh Allen or Joe Burrow. You know what I mean? So I think it's just a bet. Like there's going to be people in the comments that say there's no way that these guys will be like T-Law. They're better than him. You know, Caleb has Ben Johnson now. He'll never fail like T-Law did. But when we're talking fantasy points, there's just a lot of different ways to slice this. And if you just go and look at the distribution, whether you want to call it WAR or fantasy production on a curve or a graph, like when you get past the QB 8, 9 range, it's a big cluster. And then when you get past like QB 20, that's when you start getting into like true replacement level production, because we could go a step further, and maybe this is a future show. I don't know which of Daniel Jones, Jameis Winston, Justin Fields, Will Levis, those guys are going to get another chance to start. But if you told me Jameis Winston and Daniel Jones were starting, like you could sell me on how they outproduce Trevor Lawrence and Bryce Young for fantasy. I just don't feel as good with them as an asset. But unless you're using these quarterbacks as assets, you're not getting better production from Trevor Lawrence than you are Daniel Jones on a per game basis. You just don't have any asset in Daniel Jones. He's like, when he's not starting, nobody wants him. He's a throw in. When he is starting, no one will give you a first because he's failed before. But I think thinking about the quarterback landscape in that way, in terms of how you want to build your team, I think there's a lot more merit to almost avoiding this range if you don't have it because you have to pay for it. If you have Lamar Jackson, what you need from your QB2 is just to keep up with, I don't know, Bryce Young and Trevor Lawrence, which Shane has talked about, is not that hard to do. But do I have to pay a 6th round startup price to get that when I can grab Kirk Cousins and Will Levis 10 rounds later because they are not starting? And I just need to have some luck that they start. It feels like if I'm right on those guys, that's where you can really get some good value and you're not losing much production.
On that point, because I know people jump in the comments like, oh, Will Levis and I don't care, Daniel Jones, they'll never start. You're wasting assets, blah, 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 blah. I don't think any of us are saying, oh, I expect them to turn into Baker. I expect them to turn into Sam Darnold. It's just literally just taking that shot because it's super cheap as opposed to paying actual assets for players that, like Scott said, you know, the ceiling isn't that much higher. So I just want to make that point. Like, we're not saying go out there and be like, yeah, you should give up 2nd rounders for these dudes, right? No, we're saying get them as a throw-in, get them late in the draft instead of allocating assets, good assets to mediocre players.
The most mispriced QB on KTC is quarterback 41, Aaron Rodgers. It's basically like he's dead. He'll never play again. But if he says I'm coming back, like he's what? Top 25? You know what I mean? He's right there with Gardner Minshew, and he's behind Taysom Hill and Joe Milton. Who would you rather have, Joe Milton or Aaron Rodgers? I mean, that feels like the lowest hanging fruit player where I can just look and go, Aaron Rodgers is either starting or he's retiring. There's no like he's going to fight Jameis Winston for the starting job. It's either going to be he's a starter or he's not. And I think that's the thing that you have to look at with Jameis Winston or Daniel Jones. Like they're on the cusp of getting a chance. It's just going to be a matter of where they land. There's some theory in terms of how you can build your teams. And I think this year you can get some of those guys cheap enough. That's why the any quarterback on a 2-deep strategy works. And I think it works best if you actually don't pay for the QB2. You outscored the Jared Goff and CJ Stroud QB room if you just had Aiden O'Connell and Jaden Daniels. You know what I mean? Like all you needed was the dog shit replacement level QB, not even Jameis Winston or Daniel Jones. We know when those guys play, same with Fields, any of Daniel Jones, Jameis Winston, and Justin Fields, when they play, they're ranked ahead of a lot of the guys we value in Dynasty on a weekly basis. They're just not an asset, right? So imagine how good it could be if you hit on a Daniel Jones that's starting for a team for half the year. Plus you have Josh Allen. That's just gravy that you're getting Daniel Jones's points. And if he puts up a top 12 week, you're crushing everybody else unless they have Lamar and Burrow. And there's only one other team that probably has one of those QB rooms. Everybody else is just starting their Purdy and Tua and hoping they're having good weeks. That's it. So I think when you have an elite QB, the play isn't to go, I drafted Josh Allen, and then I have to trade Trevor Lawrence or Jordan Love in round 3 or round 4. That's not the way to play it. I think it's, okay, I'll gamble that I will find another guy. And I may need Fields, Winston, Levis, Stafford, Cousins, I need all of those guys, which means my round 12 through 20 might just be all backup QBs, but I didn't pay for a QB2. I didn't pay round 4 prices for Bryce Young or Baker Mayfield. I just skipped there and just continued to hammer running backs and receivers and tight ends. That's the way I would play it if I was doing a snake startup right now.